Radio for readers, Bookmark.
This is Bookmark. I'm Marc Bernier. The nation's top authors are coming up next.
Bookmark.
You know, one of the many benefits of doing the Miami Book Fair every year for the last several years has been the fact that we get to talk with a lot of authors about history. And as so many of our listeners are big history buffs,
Great.
This book is different from any other that we've done. The title is called Ecstatic Nation. Brenda Wineapple is with us, and among her many talents and places that she frequents as an educator is the MFA program. One of the schools is Columbia University.
That's right.
This covers the period of history in the United States from 1848 to 1877. So this is pre-Civil War, post and Reconstruction.
That's right.
Why did you choose to write about this?
Well, you know, in a very standard way, the most standard thing about the book is the period. And the period is always thought of as starting 1848 because it's the end of the Mexican War. And with the end of that war, there was a tremendous amount of territory the United States acquired, which meant there were going to be arguments about whether that territory was slave or free. 1877 is usually thought of the cutoff of this particular period because it's considered the end of Reconstruction with the election of Rutherford B. Hayes. So I was, in a sense, given that period or taking that period that is known by historians, you know, high school students, whatever,
Okay.
and I wanted to give us a different and fresh, I hoped, look at it and a different path through it.
Okay, lots of questions. Here we go.
Okay.
1848.
That's right.
When the Mexican War ends, Zachary Taylor is the hero. He later becomes president.
Right.
Now we get a treaty so that we get Texas
That's
from
right.
Mexico.
Huge amount of,
It's a huge deal. But
Yeah.
right after that, there's the Gadsden Purchase. What happened? Was this a case where American politicians said, oh, yeah, we got all this. You know what? That's not quite enough. Let's go get this. But the Mexicans said, we'll sell it to you.
Yeah.
What was going on there that we wanted that?
Well, we wanted territory. I mean, partly it's manifest destiny. That's a sort of term that was
That comes
called.
at that point.
Yeah, it comes at that point with the sense that America is growing, should grow, that democracy is the best government and should be allowed to expand and bring democracy to people who don't have it, as well as bring new markets to the Americans who do have it. Underneath that is the desire for territorial expansion because the South was beginning to feel that the North had lost its parity in Congress, in government, and they wanted to expand the number of slave states. And so that becomes a problem, too, for both North and South.
Okay, before we get to the compromises that happened, the
Yeah.
Missouri Compromise and all that, Texas becomes a state, memory, 1845? roughly?
Around that time.
Around
a little
that time.
later, I think.
Because the Gadsden Purchase happens around 48, 49?
Yeah. All around the same time.
It's right at the bottom,
It's right
though.
at the, It's all at the same time. That's right.
Was there a river separating the two countries? How is it that that piece of land
I
is
don't
there?
know. I really don't know in
Really?
that particular case. Yeah, I really don't know. And,
Okay.
the actual, the geographical dimensions of
Okay.
that. But you can see that idea of purchase. I mean, the idea of purchase is completely reasonable in a sense. The idea of takeover is something else. And you can say the Mexican War was fought to take over. You also have then in the Southeast groups of people unauthorized by the government trying to take over, say, Cuba. When, of course, the Spanish didn't want to sell Cuba. It was not going to be a Cuban purchase like the Gadsden
We were
Purchase.
looking already to Cuba?
Absolutely. Welcome to the 20th century, because it starts in the 19th century, where groups of mainly Southerners, but with Northern finance, go and they actually invade Cuba, thinking that they could overthrow the Spanish government, annex Cuba, and make it a slave state. It's absolutely unthinkable.
See, I did not know that.
Yeah.
At
And
the
that's
end-
why I wanted to start the book there, because we usually think of Mexico, Gadsden, all of that in the West, or the Southwest. But actually in the Southeast, the same thing was going on. The urge for territorial expansion is not only, as I said, an urge for new markets, for sure, but also has to do with the political anxieties and arguments that are rocking the country at this particular time.
I look at some maps that show that American troops made their way so far down into Mexico. They got to Montezuma. I mean, they were really far back. Was there a thought somewhere along the way that part of Manifest Destiny is, look, if we can take it, we're going to take it? Because we had troops that far down. Did they think they were going to take it?
Well, probably. I mean, I can't answer for what people were thinking, but you also have the push against it. I start the book in 1848 with the death of John Quincy Adams, and John Quincy Adams actually dies in the House of Representatives. He dies as he lived, which is, fighting for government and being a representative, being a member of Congress, being a president, being many things that he was. And one of the very last words that he said, which is fascinating, was no. He was voting no against giving more medals to Mexican War veterans, because he thought that war and that kind of sense of expansion was absolutely awful.
Interesting to note, too, for our listeners and viewers, John Quincy Adams, 6th president, son of John Adams,
That's right.
is one of the few instances in American history where a person, after serving as president, goes to a lesser office as a congressman.
And actually has a tremendous influence as a congressman. And I think probably people could argue that he was a better congressman than he was president. And what was interesting to me among that, because that's the end of an era. I start at the end of an era to give you a new era, because he was the last real connection with the so-called revolutionary generation, because he had been the son of John Adams, and that was the last, that world was over in a way.
Okay, when you start this book, James K. Polk, the 11th president, is in office, and I think he may be the last of the Whigs, maybe not.
Yeah.
And then he hands off to Taylor, who only serves for 2 years and then dies. What's Polk's feeling or attitude at that time? Is he part of the Manifest Destiny crowd?
Sure.
He is?
Absolutely, because the war was under his administration, certainly. So you're moving out of that when you get Taylor, and then you get these series of presidents.
Fillmore, Pierce, Buchanan.
Yeah, Fillmore, Pierce, Buchanan. Not exactly names to conjure with these days. And in some ways, I would say Pierce was a dreadful president, but then he was followed by somebody who was even more dreadful.
But Fillmore was called the do-nothing president, wasn't he?
Yeah, I mean, he was. But he wasn't, he in some sense inherited the office.
Because Taylor died in office.
Yeah, exactly, and then he wasn't elected afterwards.
Taylor was only in office for a couple of years, so he doesn't get much done.
No.
Mexican War is finished.
Oh, yeah.
He wins based on his victories and how he looks.
Yeah.
Do we know much in those 2 years about Taylor's attitude about Manifest Destiny?
Yeah,
he was.
I mean, he had ties to the South. He had ties to Manifest Destiny, certainly, but he was moving in a direction that was trying to put a lid. He put a lid on these they were called filibusters, these Cuban invaders. He was much more reasonable than you might have thought that he would be, given his background, given his war background, given his ties to the South. But he didn't last that long, so it's really hard to know what direction he would go in.
Okay, so as you outlined, it's Fillmore, Pierce, and then Buchanan, and they sort of kicked the ball back and forth on the slavery issue,
Terrible.
Coming up with a compromise that at one point, correct me if I'm wrong, Brenda, for each new state that comes in as a slave state, there has to be an accompanying free state.
Well, there had been that parity since 1820 with the Compromise of 1820, which was that you let, I forget now, you let Maine in as a free state, and you let, and I'm forgetting the other state in, but there was that kind of parity. Compromise of 1850 had to do with how we're going to divide up this so-called spoils, the territory from the purchase and also from the Mexican War, and so that there was some kind of parity tried to set up in that particular way, so that the slave trade was outlawed in the District of Columbia, but there was still slavery. There was that sense of, well, we want to table this issue. We don't want to upset the balance of power, so-called, and we don't want to alienate Southerners. And because so many Southerners at the time were what you call fire eaters, and they were moving toward a secessionist point of view and a very belligerent point of view.
The country is fragmented, Brenda, as I recall.
Yeah.
Arizona and New Mexico are simply territories.
That's right.
Texas comes in as a southern slave
Right,
state.
that's right.
California
Wants to
is a free state?
That's right. California comes in as a free state. And
Okay, we aren't dealing with Oregon and Washington yet, though,
Not yet.
right?
Those are still territories.
Wow.
And then, of course, there's the Nebraska territory, and that's what becomes problematic in 1854 under the Pierce administration, because Pierce allows the Stephen Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Act to be passed by Congress, and what that means is an effective repeal. So it effectively undoes the previous compromises, because it allows the notion of popular sovereignty, so that people in the territory theoretically could vote slavery up or down, which seems, well, I don't know what it seems. To those who believe in popular sovereignty, it seemed reasonable, but to those who thought slavery is a moral failure of the country, it's not reasonable, because people could vote in a slave constitution. How reasonable is that? So you can see the pot was boiling, and then when Kansas tried to vote against slavery, you had pro-slavery people from Missouri crossing the border and actually voting in the Kansas elections. It was a mess.
Is that where we have the expression 54-40 or fight come from?
That's earlier.
Okay.
Yeah, no.
And then is that how John Brown
Yes.
ended up doing his raids?
Yes,
It comes
John
as a
Brown
result?
actually learns his skills, if you want to call him that. In the Kansas territory in the 1850s, he and some of his family are out there, and they are part of the anti-slavery agitation against the pro-slavery people, and so he actually starts out there in terms of the violence that he's associated with, and what's called the Potawatomi massacre, of which he was a part, and people in the North sort of knew that he was a part of that. And then, of course, by the end of the 1850s, in 1859, you have a Harper's Ferry invasion.
We're talking with Brenda Wineapple. She's the author of the book Ecstatic Nation for our radio audience, and it's the part of American history. It goes from 1848 to 1877. So we're up to Harper's Ferry, 1859. We're right on the verge of the Civil War starting.
That's right.
Fort Sumter, 1860 or 1861? Around that era. I think it's the trigger
Yes,
that
it is.
starts the Civil War in South Carolina.
Right, that's right.
Lincoln is president.
That's right.
When he comes in, Buchanan hands the reins to Lincoln. Does
Right.
Lincoln know what he's coming into?
Probably. I know he was. One thing Lincoln was not was naive. So he definitely knew what he was coming into. I had to have known what he was coming into, because basically by the time he took office, there's many Southern states had already seceded. 1861 is the time of Fort Sumter, because it's the first kind of crisis of his presidency. But the crises of his presidency actually started from the minute he was elected, because the minute he was elected, many radicals in the South felt that was the end for them, and they wanted to start seceding, which is, again, unthinkable in a certain way. He was actually democratically elected in 1860, and he was the president. So he knew, of course he knew. He didn't say much in that period that it's called a long secession winter, before he was actually inaugurated. But he was putting his cabinet together, and he was taking advice, and by the time he got into office in Sumter, I think we all think that he handled all of that pretty well.
Brenda, Appomattox and the treaty is signed. The war ends. I'm fast forwarding through that.
Yeah.
Lincoln is assassinated shortly after that.
Yeah, days. Within a hair's breadth of Appomattox.
So my question is, did Lincoln have a contingency plan for Reconstruction in place, or did that all fall to Johnson to deal with?
Well, nobody really knows. Lincoln was already talking about Reconstruction, and the term is actually, that was the term used at the time. And he was beginning to think, and it seemed people who parse his second inaugural and tried to see what he would have done, seems that he would have tempered justice with mercy, that he was a kind man. And so there it's with any death of a president. People try to speculate, well, he would have done this, or he would have gone that way, or this way. So nobody really knows. It did all fall to Johnson, no doubt about it. I mean, there was no time, really.
Johnson survives an impeachment vote by one.
Yeah.
It's a very tense, tenuous time.
Unbelievable.
So Johnson is a kind of a broken man. There's no chance he's going to seek election in 1868, is there?
Well, I think he probably wanted to. Who was going to nominate him at that particular point? You know, I think that he'd managed rightfully. I mean, he alienated quite a number of people. I think he would have wanted to stay. I don't think. It's interesting you say he was broken. I don't think he was.
Really?
No, I mean, you would think he was, but I think he really had a very firm belief in what he was doing. He was, again, from my point of view, there was some ways in which he was deeply committed, again, my point of view, to the wrong side of things, and that he really felt that he was doing right.
Because two things come during this time. Tyler, the 10th president, runs and serves in the Senate in the Confederacy. I read about that.
Mm-hmm.
When Johnson comes out of office, if I'm not mistaken, doesn't he run for the Senate from Tennessee?
Yeah, I think he does. I think he does. Yeah,
And
so
he ends up
that's
dying.
not broken. That's not.
Yeah.
That's
Okay,
not
so
broken.
thank you for helping me with
no,
that.
no. I mean, I think he had a very clear sense of what he wanted, and I think, to a certain extent, what he wanted to do, and this is why Congress was so riled by him, was in many ways turn back the clock. I mean, he knew that the war had been won by the North, but in some sense that he was making it impossible for former slaves to live in the South, and also, many Northerners and Republicans.
Am I correct that Johnson was having his feet held to the fire to be tough on blacks as Reconstruction
I don't know
comes
who
in
was
or
holding
not?
his feet to the fire. I think he was happy to hold his. I mean, I think that's what he wanted to do. But there were numbers of former Confederates, people who had been in the government, slave owners who were definitely pushing against the Freedmen's Bureau. They were trying to make sure that there was no redistribution of land. They wanted their land back, and they wanted basically free labor.
Okay. Help us understand, how does Grant come to prominence? Big hero in the Civil War.
Tremendous hero.
Was there anybody else that they were looking at beside Grant?
No, I mean, there were other candidates, but they're all really forgettable. Grant was the man. He was the man of the hour. I don't know. I'm just guessing, when you have a general like that, maybe Eisenhower, could have the same kind of tremendous popularity because he's associated with victory. And he was a very quiet man, and so that he didn't say anything to upset people. So he was able to unite what was becoming factionalized in the Republican Party. He was a Republican, a Lincoln Republican. And so everybody rallied around him for the election, after Johnson.
I appreciate
1868.
how you're keeping up with this, because we're trying to
No,
cram
I'm
an
doing
awful
good.
lot
It's
in
okay.
a little period of
I
time.
know, it's a lot.
2 terms for Grant. I
2 terms
read
for Grant.
that Grant is almost penniless, though, when he's coming out. He writes his memoirs in an effort to have some money to pass on to his family members.
He had money. It wasn't that he was penniless when he came out of office. He had money, and he made some money, but he invested it. By then, you're in the Gilded Age, and he made some dreadful investments, and he was I think probably not a great businessman. There was a lot of corruption that was associated with his administration. So he knew a lot of people who were shady. They were swindlers. And he was basically swindled. So that by the time of his illness, he had cancer, he was absolutely and virtually penniless, as you say. And there were numbers of Civil War veterans writing their memoirs at this particular time, and Grant began to write his for money. And Mark Twain got involved and said, I can negotiate a better deal for you, and did. And Grant was ill and nonetheless wrote out the memoirs that were able to sustain his family financially after his death. And they're still selling very well. And they're Gertrude Stein's one of her favorite books, the memoirs of Grant.
That memory sticks in my mind from the time I was 9 years old. I have a picture of Grant sitting in a
there.
chair.
That's right, in upstate New York, writing his memoirs. All kind of. That's right.
Okay. Well, this is the first time I've talked about this.
Covered.
Almost 50 years.
It's a very powerful and moving picture of him, because he's sick and he's writing against death in a sense.
Help me with this last one.
Sure.
1877, we'll have an election. Rutherford B. Hayes, who a lot of Americans wouldn't remember, but he's a good trivia question. This election's bizarre.
Yeah, the 76 election is, in a sense, everybody was rotten in this particular election. And you could argue that, the Republicans stole it from the Democrats because Tilden was actually got the popular vote. However, that popular vote wasn't so popular because people, especially in the South, had been prohibited from voting. So it was a mess, and that's why the election that finally, it was contested election, and what finally happened was the so-called compromise. 1876, which is Hayes can be, the Republicans can get the White House, but they have to pull troops out of the South and Reconstruction. I mean, that's how the compromise has become by historians understood. It's probably not quite that, but for the sake of us and your audience, it's enough to know Hayes was elected in a very contested, fractious election, got in by this hair or whatever it is, the skin of his teeth, and then in that sense, whatever deals were made or were not made, Reconstruction is considered over because the troops, what federal troops were left in the South, were taken out.
What do we know about Hayes? I think he served in the military.
Yeah.
Was he close to Grant? Is he totally an outsider? What do we know about Rutherford B. Hayes?
Well, you know that he was he served quite a bit as governor and representative in Ohio. So he was a political figure. A lot of people thought he was pretty colorless. That he was. That you could float his name without offending much of anyone. I think Clover Adams, who was Henry Adams' wife, said that she found his look to be pretty vapid. So he again becomes one of the he enters that pantheon of forgotten presidents. And he was a one-term president. And he said, I mean, for good or ill, he said, I'm only going to serve one term to show that he was an honest guy who wasn't really there for political ambition, whatever.
Does he change his mind before Garfield comes in?
Probably.
Yeah. Okay.
Who knows? Yeah, I don't know.
In an earlier interview, we talked about Lincoln as it relates to his Secretary of War, or Seward,
yeah.
who bought Alaska.
Right,
is that
later.
part of the Manifest Destiny as well?
Sure.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, when Seward buys Alaska, Lincoln is, of course, dead, the war is over. But absolutely, there's more territory, and that there's a kind of expansion, new markets. America wants new markets, new territory, new places for people to settle, so yes, it's very definitely part of that.
This is outside of the confines of your book, but there is an era that follows this immediately. The Spanish-American War, 20 years later.
Right.
We look at the Philippines, Hawaii,
Right.
those islands,
Right.
all part of the spoils in the war with Spain over
Right.
Cuba, correct?
Yeah, right.
Do we end up getting, as part of our settlement, the Philippines?
Yeah. Well, we don't get Cuba.
We don't get Cuba, ever.
No, and Cuba is always a kind of thorn in the side of the United States. So even in the 1850s, not everybody, but people looking down at Cuba, and you see that up into the 1960s and the Cuban Missile Crisis and all of those things. It's very interesting that Cuba stays Cuba has a kind of integrity that lasts. But yes, the Spanish-American War is is later, and some of the same racial concerns, I think, that you see from the Civil War, and also the war really that's waged after the Civil War and even during it against the Indians is part of that.
Final question, particularly as it relates to that. Is there any foresight that you can tell from your research that America is concerned about a lookout post in Alaska? Obviously, we don't have the technology, we don't have missiles and all that, but is there any worry, or was there any part of this deal to buy Alaska that America wanted to protect the continent somehow from the Russians coming in the other side? We were always worried about the English, the French, and the Spanish, and the Monroe Doctrine was supposed to kick them all out. Was there worry in Washington? We need to keep an eye on Asia. The world is still very vast, but what if they decide they're going to send all their trappers into Alaska? It's a little close.
Sure, I think it's less martial than it is economic. Because after all, the United States wanted Canada too. And if Seward, or Sumner, who, head of foreign relations, could have negotiated a deal with England to get Canada as, some kind of war remuneration because England had built ships, they would have been happy to have it.
Yeah, I just read 2 weeks ago where there was a movement before your book, history, where we made an overture for Canada to come in with us, and they said, "No, it's all right. We'll sit this one out."
Yeah, and as Charles Sumner, when he was negotiating what's called the Atlantic claims after the war, he really would have liked to have been able to get not only war reparations, but as part of the territory. And of course, that wasn't going to happen, but nonetheless, so yes, of course.
Could talk to you for hours. It's a great book. It's called Ecstatic Nation. Brenda Wineapple, the author and guest on Bookmark. Thank you for this wonderful exercise in going through these years of American history.
My pleasure, truly. Thank you.
That's Bookmark for this week. If you have comments or thoughts on future authors, send an email to us at our website, bookmark.us. That's our broadcast for today. Thanks for watching.